Right. Would you like me to begin?
Definitely.
Some of you have heard the previous part of my life from about 1938 through to the end of the 40s. So you know that I was in a children's home for about a month and that I was evacuated into London, not out. And that there was all sorts of disruption in my education and everything else. But it all changed when my father came back at the end of the war and he was demobbed. He'd actually had a bomb dropped on him by the Americans while he was in the cookhouse, and he'd lost the sight partially in one eye. He had worked as a printer before the war and went back to Croppers, that was a place in Thatcham, and asked for his old job back. And they offered him his job back at lower wages, and he refused it. He then went and painted prefabs in the Newbury area, which lots of demobbed men were doing at that time. And then, because he'd been qualified as a cook in the army, it was his way of not hoping not to kill anybody while the war was going on. They worked out, him and his mate, that if they were in the cookhouse, then they were warm, they were fed, and they were very unlikely to kill anyone as they went through the war. But BOAC were then at Aldermaston, and Aldermaston was an aerodrome in those days, and the planes were coming in and out with the relief for Berlin. So it was where all the food was going in to central Berlin to save the people that were starving. And having recently seen on TV the history of the fall of Berlin, it was horrendous. The people really needed help. And then eventually BOAC decided to leave, and they went back to London Airport, where they were going to do all the relief from there. And they offered him his job in London. As he walked from London to Thatcham to get the job in the printing firm, he didn't want to go back. He had family there, but at the same time, he loved the rural background. So he got the first job he could get, which was in Mac's Cafe, which was on the A4 Bath Road between Reading and Newbury. I had a big teapot on the roof, I remember as a child. Something you remember quite a lot is having things like that around. He would come home with stories of homeless people. Oh, they had railway carriages attached to the cafe at the back, so people could get bed and breakfast before they go on. So they were picking up homeless people, people who were on long journeys, long distance lorry drivers. And when I eventually got work out that way, the long distance lorry drivers knew that I was Tom Benham's daughter and would give me a lift if I was in trouble. Which means that I was beginning to realize that for some people, life wasn't very good. My father had been a racing cyclist in his youth. He was Southwest Road champion, one or 2 years. There are medals that I have here. But the two shields I've given to my two younger brothers. The best one is in America and the other one is in Ireland. So he had a life. And it's one of the reasons why, when I was young, I could mend a puncture on a bike instantly. I don't know about batteries, so I can't help Stephen. So you get some idea of poverty was around. I attended St Mary's Church of England school, which was into corporal punishment. And at one stage, was accused of speaking while the headmaster was speaking. Actually, it wasn't me, it was a girl next to me, but I had my hand caned. But we had big caning sessions. I remember one with a boy called Stacy, where 4 teachers held him down while he was caned. And they held him across a desk, and the desk walked across the floor. It was so violent. And I think I learnt there how injustice could be done to people when it was assumed that they'd done wrong. There was a little boy who had some sort of disability called Robert. There was no special education in those days for people with his condition. He was a lovely person, but we were told he was going to die, and he did. But we assimilated him in among us children, so he was part of us. We also had 2 twin brothers that stayed. There was only 4 classes in that school, and the 2 brothers stayed in class 1 for the whole of the time I was there. I think that the school took from about 7 or 8 to 15. They just put the age up to youngsters staying on till 15. And these 2 brothers just couldn't learn to read and write. When they left school, years later, I found one of them had been adopted by an artist, and he was absolutely brilliant at art. In other words, nobody had ever found out what abilities he really had in that school. Yes, it's from 7 to 15, I think, with 4 classes. We had curtains in the big hall between the classes, so you could always hear what was going on in other classes as you were taught. That's the way it was in the old days for many people. My mother insisted that the school had never had anyone other than the headmaster's daughter and her best friend ever passed the 11 plus. She became an absolute pain in the side of Mr. Shaw, the head teacher, and was on constantly about standards of education being appalling in the school. He hated her. She didn't like him either. And she also felt it was a bit of a waste trooping us in a crocodile half a mile down to the church to attend church services at times. So I was at a school where the headmaster didn't actually like my brother and I in any way whatsoever, because we were associated with this woman that would never give up. We did make friends. We were friends with David Shorey, and he was the son of a farmer and on Lawrence at the top of Lawrence's Lane. So we went up there to float pigs' troughs on ponds, get filthy dirty, get into the hay bales, and we ate whatever we could. Cow cake was one of the things we used to go by the troughs and just grab a handful. Mangel wurzels we used to chop up and eat those. We had water out of the water troughs for cows. When you think about it, there was no hygiene whatsoever going on in those days. It was appalling, but we were surviving. And I remember my mother made me a lovely dress. She had to make a lot of my clothes for me to first be able to afford having clothes. And I went up, and my brother and David were creosoting a chicken house, and I'm afraid I got creosote on the brand new dress. My name was Mud, absolutely. As you know, my brother had polio. I told you last time. So my mother was being told that we should get swimming classes, that it would help all his muscles develop and try to help him get back. And so She actually had just started and gone into an agreement with another woman to run two kiosks that gave tea, cakes, biscuits, one in Victoria Park in Newbury and the other one in the swimming pool um, down the other on the west side of Newbury. So I started to learn to swim, and I had a man who I only know as Gabby, who had been in the Navy and put limpet mines on German boats during the war. So he was extremely good at underwater swimming and taught me. And I became quite active in winning things in swimming. So at least I felt that I was achieving something when I was older, but I have jumped a bit. I'm sure I have. I want to tell you about Mr. Cooper. I told you that half the village was named Cooper. Mr. Cooper looked after the shower horses for Sir William Mount, which was a cottage, well, it was two cottages just up the road from where we lived. We knew him well. And my brother one day came across him with the two horses, and one had fallen onto its front knees on icy hill. And he was struggling to try to get this horse to stand up. So my brother and I went and helped. And after he'd managed to get the horse out of all its harness, he got it onto its feet and he wanted to take it off to put in the stable and have a look at the leg. And we stayed with the other horse and the cart while he was away. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen an adult cry. He had tears running down his face. He absolutely loved those horses. And you can understand it because it wasn't just his living. It was the two he was responsible for. I'm going to jump a bit and I'll go back later. But after the war, Sir William Mount sold all the farms and all the property that he owned in Cold Ash and in Thatcham area. Before that, he had all the trees cut down, the ancient oaks that I'd known as a child. They were all cut down and sent off for logging. So that many of the woods, the country lanes around looked absolutely bare, whereas they weren't when I was young. And then he sold the farms one at a time off to other people. Mr. Cooper was told that he had to go down and take the horses in to the knacker's yard to have them put down. And he did. He came home and he committed suicide. And that's the way things were. They were really roaring when we were young. I assume that there would have been help of some sort for what was happening. There were people unemployed in the village that had done decent work, and all sorts of things started to fall to pieces. Poverty came in at the beginning of the 1950s because of that. Lawrence's Lane, when I went back recently, is called Cooper's Lane. And that is because of the Evases. They were Quakers that bought the two cottages and turned them into one. They had three daughters. I believe that Bridget and Rachel, one of them married a weighty friend somewhere in London. But she certainly visited me when I was in Cyprus, when she was doing work for UNESCO, which didn't go down very well with the army at the time. So I was learning about things could dramatically change very, very quickly in other people's lives around. My best friend was Margaret. And she had a sister called Janet. And the first time I went down to their house in Lower Way, they had no furniture, well, a lot of the furniture was missing. And I found out that her father was an alcoholic, that he kept selling, putting in the furniture for short periods and then getting it back again. And that Margaret had a very unstable background. She was a lovely girl, and we got on so well together. Eventually, they moved into the council houses, and I know that he was supposed to suffer from moon madness. You don't hear that nowadays, but that's what they used to say it was. And he used to beat his children a lot. He actually died, my mother told me, just after I'd left the village. And she said the whole family blossomed. And they became completely different human beings after that. We also, for some unknown reason, seemed to have people who were homeless. We called them gentlemen of the road. We were always to respect them. And they would knock on my mother's door and ask her to fill up their chatties with tea and had they any food for them. And we understood that if you were kind to people that were homeless, they put a mark on your door gate. And my brother and I looked and looked and looked, and we could never find this mark. But we had the homeless knocking at our door, and how they'd found us, I would never know. But then my mother also, because we were 7 miles out of Newbury, the dustman had to come a long way, and she would always give them a cup of tea. It got talked about, but she would always give them a cup of tea. So I came from a very caring family who cared not only about us, but about the world around us and what was happening to other people. Um, Margaret, by the way, did very well and got qualified as a chemist in the village. Brilliant. Just what should happen. I failed the 11 plus, which was no surprise, despite the fact that I had an uncle in London who was a teacher and then a head teacher teaching in the East End, who sent examples of exam papers down for me to sit down with my mother and father and go through. And my mother was determined I wouldn't stay in that school. And she had friends that had come, that she'd moved down with the family with the board mill from London. So she was a Cockney Irish. It was in your face. There was no doubt when my mother was in a room, we knew she was in a room. But yeah, I used to hide. um, she had friends that had subsequently become councillors in Newbury, and she got them to help her get me into Shaw House Secondary Modern School, Newbury. And so I had to travel 4.5 miles into Newbury to go to another school. Best thing that ever happened to me. To my surprise, I went into the A class, the A, B, and C's in those days. They actually did show you the differences between you. And I stayed there for 4 years. And I actually got 4 years of education, which was wonderful. The year after, because there was a year and 3 months between me and my brother also failed the 11 plus. My mother found out he'd failed on the reference of Mr. Shaw, who'd actually said that he was going to turn into a thief and a thug when he grew up. Well, no, he didn't. He actually went to Park House School, which was the equivalent secondary modern of Shaw House School. She was determined we weren't going to stay at that school anymore. And he came away with all sorts of qualifications. He got an apprentice with Southern Electricity Board, and then he went to College Harlech in Wales and went on to do economics at London University. But what worries me is that many of the people in that village didn't have the same chances as I had and he had. They were trapped in a system that didn't educate people and didn't value people. Yeah, I've jumped some of this, mother's education. My mother running these, having a partnership, and I can't remember the woman's name that she had the partnership with, but running these two kiosks was really good for us. Not only was I learning and my brother learning to swim, and it was helping him so that he was getting his muscles back working properly again, but we were also mixing with people that were educated. I ended up as the swimming champion for breaststroke for that area. The other kiosk was in the local park in Newbury, and again, my mother was giving cups of tea to the homeless. She was making sure they had something to eat, and it was all being done because after the war, there were so many people that had had their lives completely wrecked by being bombed out and everything else. There was one homeless woman there called Winnie Legg. The rumours were that she was very, very well off, and she had a boyfriend. And subsequently, although she'd been living rough, for somehow or other she'd maintained bank accounts. And yes, she was very well off. But that didn't ever stop my mother ever helping anybody else. It was always there. I learnt to row on the Kennet and Avon Canal because she was friendly with Mr. Davis that had the narrow boat there. And I suppose really I was being educated not only to read and write, but also to understand that other people didn't have perfect lives through no fault of their own. There were things that happened to people that you couldn't actually get over, or many of them didn't. I'm also going to tell you about the Catholic Church in Newbury because I stood beside my mother one day while she was talking to this Roman Catholic priest. And he looked down and looked at me and said, "Oh, this is one of your bastards, is it?" So I asked my mother what a bastard was. She was a lapsed Catholic. They had left the Catholic Church when her brother had been smashed to pieces by a train at Thatcham. And this priest had actually said it was because all the younger children had been skipping going to church. So it was their fault and they're to blame. And all the children left the Catholic Church, even the ones in London that hadn't come down with the family. But she was a Catholic, and we knew she was a Catholic. My brother and I always had no doubt that what we had was a Catholic mother with lots of very, very definite principles and ethics, who had lost her church because her church had abandoned the family just at the moment when they needed being supported more than ever. When she was running this business, the kiosk, she had two more children. So I have two very younger brothers, and my mother had a bike that had a charge seat on the back and a sidecar at the side. And the sidecar was not only to take things in and out for the business, it was also where my youngest brother went and laid as a baby. So she was dealing with two more children while she was doing it. My father was not very well. Although he'd been working at Max Cafe, he was coming out from boiling hot kitchens into freezing cold and having to cycle 8 miles home. And he kept getting pneumonia, and he also got cancer round his throat. So he had his throat cut, and they cut the cancer out, and miracles happened. It went away, and he was healthier afterwards. But it was the doctor said if you go on working in those conditions, it's not going to do your health any good whatsoever. So he became a postman, which was getting out in cold again, and cycling. But he seemed to get healthier getting out into the fresh air. And so we got our father back again. He also was, we had a very big garden with fruit trees. It was always impeccably looked after and dug. He looked after a garden down in the village for someone who couldn't look after a garden, an elderly lady with a mansion house with an old-fashioned garden at the back, and he had an allotment. And all this food was pouring out into the community, not just for us, so that we were part of an economy that didn't make very much money, but actually existed for people. I think being brought up like that left its mark, very, very definitely. Um, I used to have, because we were not very well off, have second-hand clothes from my cousin in London. Cousin Doreen always used to say things like, "Oh, you're not wearing that old thing still, are you?" And as I said, my mother made clothes. She'd in the East End of London. When she was 14, she worked for some Jewesses, and she could crochet, she could knit, she could sew. And what happened was the girls in the shop not only sold things, but in their spare time, when there wasn't a customer in the shop, they had to make things to put on sale. So it was like a little factory inside a shop. Subsequently, I can knit and I can crochet. And I used to have to knit string into my socks to make sure they lasted longer. See, people don't talk about this now. You should, because this is poverty. And this is what's happening to so many people today. Makes me so angry. Um, my first job when I left school, I must have been coming up for 15, was with Florco. I had actually acquired one certificate because I went on a course and I had a typing certificate. So I got one piece of paper to say that I was any good at anything. Floorcloth made lino out of cardboard. They tied up with the croppers and the corrugated cases and all the rest that was on that side. But they just put a lacquer on it, and it was cheap cardboard for working class people. I stayed there for 1 year. My mother insisted that my first year at work I was not to leave. I hated it. I really did. It stank. It stank of all the chemicals that were being put onto this lino. But it also felt really not a place I wanted to be. But I did meet my first gypsy. I had seen gypsies before. They used to stay down on Lower Way in Reading vans, and my bike used to go a bit faster past them. They used to put their washing out on the hedges, so I had noticed them. But he came in to buy lino, bits off, so he could go out and sell it. And I was warned that he might fold some of his paper in two, so if you counted the pounds notes, you get one counted twice. He didn't. And I left my judgment for what travellers were really like. I then went on to I was trained as a GPO telephone operator. However, although I passed everything, I failed because I wasn't quick enough at answering the calls. On the old GPO telephone lines where you put um, plugs into holes. Right, so really old-fashioned way of it's one of the last in the country was Newbury to change over to any other telephone system. However, that got me a job at Isotope Developments that was at Beanham House near Aldermaston, but not part of the Aldermaston. I went there as their switchboard operator, and but there was the peaceful uses of atomic energy. It was where they invented the beginnings of X-ray equipment for hospitals. Um, the Steel Company of Wales, where they could detect how hot the metal was inside the vats without anybody getting hurt, and all sorts of other things that were used and are used today. They were Harwell professionals that, while they were doing nasty bombs with radioactivity, had discovered other things that it would do and had adapted them. The place was full of young people. I really got on well with everybody there. Eventually, they changed me from being on the switchboard because I said I was bored. There wasn't enough calls coming in. And I did some maths for them and some accounts, and they said I was better than the girl they'd got. So they swapped us. And she kept her job, and I went into the accounts department. But while I was on the telephone, one of the things I had to do was collect the film badges, which was supposed to detect radioactivity and whether anyone had had a bad dose anywhere in the building. One of the workshops joked with me when they handed back a film badge that they'd actually, while the guy was on holiday, had put it on top of a liquid source of radiology. And they handed it back to me saying that one's going to fail. And it didn't, which made me suddenly realize how dangerous all of us were working in an atmosphere where there wasn't proper detection of radioactivity getting into you. And subsequently, one of the men that was in charge of going into the bunker and putting back the radioactive sources in the bunker died of leukemia. And it was horrendous to watch him losing weight and to see what was, going on inside. It worried me.
Jenny, I think it's going to have to be a part 3 to your story, because we need to have a little bit of time for some discussion about all the interesting things you've been telling us. So can you wind up for today, and we'll book another time for you to finish the story.
Well, I'll tell you later about being near the nuclear accident at Greenham Common then in the next series. Sorry about it.
All right.
I have had a really strange life.
Okay. Well, now, everybody, if you want to say something, give us a wave and unmute yourself. Christopher. Surely somebody wants to say something. Graham. No. Go on then, Hattie. Go on, Hattie.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. The way that you just give us a little glimpse, the way you've articulated it and how you felt about things. I mean, and all the people's names you've remembered is just stunning. I just love it. And yeah, thank you for sharing such wonderful place. I was brought up in Berkshire too.
Kate.
Kate?
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I found that fascinating. Yeah, it made me think about my childhood, but wasn't really as difficult or varied, I don't think, as yours. But yeah, I take it you've written all this down because it would make a very interesting book.
I'm looking for a ghostwriter. I'm told I've got to go and get one. I have, over the years, just put memory and then a little bit of memory down, so that I think we ought to talk about the past. Younger generations shouldn't just think of us as older people. They should know that we have solved some of the problems for them.
Yeah.
You're quiet, David.
It was just so interesting. It reminded me very much, although I'm a bit younger, it reminded me not just of my childhood and the fierce cold after the Second World War. Terrible. We were always cold. I always had enough to eat, but I was so cold. And I was lucky because my father was always in work, and we knew so many other children whose parents weren't able to look after them well, and I realized now that they were in rags, and there I was warmly wrapped up in, for example, that very, very cold winter of 47. You know, I was wrapped from head to toe, and these kiddies, I now realize that they were rags. I was puzzled by why they were wearing summer dresses, but those were the only dresses they had. And some of the girls didn't have knickers. And how can I put it? It did not compute for years that they just didn't have things that to me were quite normal to have. Because even though we were working class people, as I say, we were lucky in that my dad was always in work. So we had enough. But it really, it's inspiring to listen to what's been, what was happening at a similar time or just before, in not that far away. I was brought up in Swindon, but it was a small industrial town in those days. So, but my parents were both from Berkshire. They're both country people, and yeah, it was really interesting making the links,
Yeah. Yeah,
Sorry.
in the old days, they used to sew them in, didn't they, to their, at the beginning of winter, children were sewn into their clothes. I only had them taken off in the spring, so they couldn't have a bath or anything.
I'm sure some friends who are around my age will remember getting up in the mornings when it was extremely cold. You could see the frost on the inside of the window.
Yeah.
And you could see your breath, and getting up and stepping on the lino, which was extremely cold.
Yeah.
And rushing to get in your clothes before your parents, my mother would say, "You haven't had a wash yet." And I would say, "Yes, I have." And she would say, "No, look, the flannel is still dry. You haven't had a wash." So I would have to get dressed and have a wash. I'm freezing. I remember it extremely well.
So we didn't have a copper. We had a concrete copper that cracked right down the middle, and the landlady wouldn't let us take it out and put in a proper copper. So that we had to ladle every bit of water into the bath and then share it.
Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We used to have a black range fireplace for cooking and heating, and we would have a
That's it.
tin bath in front of it, and Mother would ladle boiling water in and then cold water, and we'd all take turns. I was the eldest of 5, so it was quite a long process. That was after, originally I was in the kitchen sink, sort of you know, the china sink, ceramic,
Yeah.
but kneeling until my legs got too long to fit in the sink. Then I had to be transferred to the tin bath, which hung outside the back door most of the time. Yeah, a lot of what you said, Jenny, brings back memories. What's interesting, though, is how you relate it to world or national affairs. You relate it to what was going on in the wider world. It seems I had a kind of dream existence. I sailed through all this, you know, a primary school in the East End of London. The only hardship we had was the class was 52 people at 52 children at one stage, with just one teacher. They didn't have teaching assistants. Anyway, I'm sure others have got interesting memories or comments.
Mary wants to come in.
Yeah.
Jenny, do you find your own children and grandchildren ask you questions about the past?
Oh, they know.
Yeah.
I make sure they know. By the way, for Stephen's information, I've been Myers-Briggs analysed as a human being. I did it twice. Tried to get a different answer, but I didn't. I am an internationalist. If you start talking to me about what's happening under my nose, I will relate it to the world
Yeah.
and talk about what's happening to everybody.
Initiate the conversations with your grandchildren then?
Yes, I mean, they know about Grandma and Grandma. I find talking to children in the garden when you're doing jobs with them or you're playing is the best way to get through. But I think we need, all of you in this room have instances from the past. I think it's about time Facebook picked that up. Somebody's asking about whether you had an outside loo. Yeah, we all, well, most of us did. You know, we only had one fire. It was the kitchen range. The rest of the house was freezing cold. And I mean, you scavenged. Some of us, some children in the village really scavenged for food. And we knew that. It was going on all the time. It was the bits that came out at the fish and chip shop, the teeny little burnt bits. The kids ate those. Can we have your scraps, please?
It's interesting.
You've actually missed the big one. The big one's coming up because I was within a mile of the nuclear accident at Greenham Common. Shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here.
Go on, Hattie.
When I suppose I was in my was I in my 50s, I think, and we were having a conversation about the past with my brother and my dad, and he wasn't. He just was overhearing us and came into the room and he said, "Were you really that cold as children?" And we said, "Yes." And honestly, he was nearly in tears. He was so sorry because he had really tried to solve the problem by making the heater in the house spread the warm air into 2 different rooms.
Did your fingers, my fingers used to go white at the ends.
Oh, yeah.
Circulation used to start to go.
I'm gently mesmerised. That's why I've been quiet, Jenny. It's really interesting to. I was born in that cold winter, 1947. So you know, you have a few years on me, and I was, I guess, quite comfortable growing up in many ways. My father was manager of a Boots the chemist in Kent, and so we were sort of entry-level middle class, I guess. And it's really interesting to hear what people basically had to live through and deal with, and what you learn from it, and how you see others. It's wonderful. Thank you.
And yes, I had a Berkshire accent, by the way. I could do ennets and den offs and bayonets. I came to Bristol and I had to change to Bristolian.
Do your Berkshire?
Sorry?
Do your Berkshire again?
Ennets, den offs, Kinkbury Jacks. Do you know what Kinkbury Jacks are?
No.
Potatoes. Yeah.
Don't recognise that lot.
Had a row with my mother about when we were helping with the haymaking on the farm, that we had a man called Harry. And we insisted he was called Harry. And she said, no, he's Harry. And we said, anyway, you don't know him. He's Harry.
I know when I came to Bristol, I'm just trying to think, I don't know how many years ago now, just a second, 40 years ago, I came to Bristol, and I didn't understand a word people were saying. I hadn't got a clue what people were saying. I used to ask people to write it down, and they thought I was being really rude, but I was just desperate to understand them. I did pick it up quickly, but all the same, you know. And then now I go somewhere else and people say, oh, is that a Bristol accent? So I reckon I picked it up in the end.
When I first went to Wolverhampton many years ago, I went for a cup of tea in one of those kiosks, and the woman behind said, "Stereo pes." I said, "Pardon?" "Stereo pes." "Pardon?" "Sterilised or pasteurised?"
My son had trouble. He went and took his degree at Wolverhampton, and he stood up the first day to say who he was, and the whole class fell around laughing. He sorted it. He now speaks with a London accent.
This suggests to me that Bristolian has kind of faded into an understandable language for most people who arrive now. It's not so differentiated anymore.
You don't hear "where's this?" I went to a political meeting where somebody talked about it was all the problem caused by that man Gaddafi from Libya.
From Liverpool. It's a good idea. It's a good idea to look at Wikipedia on a Bristol accent. They maintain actually that it's not merely an accent, it's a dialect. Goes counter to what Hattie was suggesting.
There are words that don't exist in other places in Bristol, aren't they? Like pitching. There are words that they use that aren't in the dictionary. I think they ought to be gathered together. Somebody ought to go out and find them fast before they disappear.
There's those books, aren't there? Crack Waiter Speak Bristol or something like that. Yeah, they're quite good. But I know when I came, there seemed to be, people told me that there was a big divide between north of the river and south of the river. You know, with south
that's foreign down there. You don't go south of the river.
No, it's foreign down there.
I remember once we were talking about cultural things, and they said, well, south of the river in London, they've got a skating rink somewhere. That's it. No, I'm from north of the river.
No, I was the whole of Bristol. I went everywhere.
I presume we're all.
I like them.
I presume we're all left of centre. Do you think the country would have changed that much had it not been for the Labour government? Or would we still be very much poorer than we are now? Or maybe it's the trade unions we have to thank.
I think it's both. Because one's the conscience of the other. The trade unions are the conscience they're telling us about now, what's happening to people in work. And they are bringing the changes forward from that.
Mm.
And they put it in front of the politicians and worry the politicians till they change it. And my father, when he was in the post office in Newbury, was chair of the UPW for Newbury branch. You've missed that bit. It'll come. And I went out and got this. I found it. I knew I had it. There you are. And that's the next bit that's going to come up. Is it backwards for you?
I can read. No, that's right.
Yeah.
Nuclear eyes.
There you are.
What was the date of that?
This was only published 40 years after what happened
Oh, right.
to people like me in Newbury. All right.
What was the date of the accident, Jenny?
I think it was August 57. There were two at Greenham Common that they covered up. But I think, August 1957.
Okay.
Why do you think I go around with a CND sticker on the back of my car still? It won't come off. I was waiting for, that the Tories made you take everything, all your signs off the back of your window in your car. I'm waiting for them to come for me. I'll go to court and say why it's there. Anyway.
Well, the last few words.
Here's something which slightly amusing. You're going about the internationalist ideal. A friend, mine's mother, used to work in Bradford when originally the Asian groups came over there to work in the factories. And she said the children used to come to school. The girls would come to school wearing very light cotton dresses and jeweled sandals. And this was in the winter. And she had to chat to the parents at the school gate to encourage them to buy duffel coats and solid shoes and things like this to their children, because the parents thought going to school, you dressed up to go to school. So dressing up was wearing these clothes which the young girls used to wear, which was she said it was quite remarkable.
I cried when I had my first pair of shoes put on me. I was running around barefoot most of the time when I was young. Can I have a copy of the record, please, for this? I've got somebody that's trying to get me to talk about my history in Bristol with my voluntary work.
Yes.
But we're also, I said, you've got to go back. The roots of what I became are there.
Yes.
And I know that. The world for me.
There are audio history things, libraries, and they were recording people's war experiences in Bristol. And I've also done one for the War Museum about my evacuation. So there are people doing audio histories, but yes, you can have the recording if I'm capable of doing it. It has been recording all this time. Right, well, we've got to the end of our time. Do you want to just say a final word, Jenny, or anybody else want to a quick final word?
Yeah.
All right, Mary first. Mary.
The M Shed does personal recordings.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, Jenny, last word.
I'm putting stuff in the M Shed. I put in the archives. Have got all the letters for when I helped get the money for the Support Advice Centre, and for and the Quakers also interviewed me about helping set up the English as a second language scheme in the city. So that's in London, and I took 7 carloads of stuff up to Leeds University. They've got all the Gypsy and Traveller stuff.
Oh yeah.
So I'm trying to leave history behind, not because I want to be famous. I just think that the ordinary people's history doesn't come forward.
Mm.
And it's about time it did if
Yep.
we are to help
Yep.
change the world for the next generations.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Lovely,
thank you for
lovely last
asking me.
words.
I'll
Okay.
go back to, I've got a garden to weed.
See you all next week. Oh, David, you want to say something? Unmute yourself.
Just a techie point that when you hit the end of recording, it will create the recording for you. And what I've done with some other groups is start to put the recordings on YouTube. And then you make a YouTube channel, and then you just sort of, it creates a library fairly effortlessly, and they're together, and you can make it private so that not everybody gets access to it automatically. If somebody's given the link to a recording or to the channel, then they can find that specific one or the whole group. It's worth doing it that way.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask your advice if I need it. Mayor, Patsy, Patsy, what do you want to say?
I just wanted David to tell us what his title for next Friday.
Yeah, it's called How Evolution Works. I thought it would be a bit of fun to take on Darwin.
Take on the Bible. It all started only 3,000 years ago, didn't it? Is that true? Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah. That's when they put the flat Earth up. I think 5,000, but same ballpark.
To me. Right. Goodbye, everyone. See you next week, if not before.
Thank you.
Now, how do we stop now? Recording. End. How do we do recording? Pause. Stop recording.